Behind the scenes of Europe's most bloody conflict in this century, an unexpected alliance begins to reshape the whole scenario of war. While the world focuses on sanctions, embargoes, and battles between Ukrainians and Russians, a new force comes on the battlefield, a force that comes directly from the most closed and isolated regime on the planet, North Korea. According to information revealed by the Ukraine and South Korea intelligence service, North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un prepares to send up to 30,000 soldiers to fight alongside Russian troops in Ukraine. This is not the first time this has happened. Shipping North Korean troops to reinforce Russia has been underway since the end of 2024. But now the scale of this operation reaches a new level. By the end of 2024, the approach between Moscow and Pyongyang intensified as never before. North Korea, which has been facing a brutal economic block for years, has seen in Kremlin a valuable opportunity to gain space, resources, and, of course, military power. What started as a veiled operation, where each movement was treated with absolute secret, quickly gained a new chapter. In early 2025, Kremlin himself publicly confirmed the presence of North Korean soldiers on the front, something that seemed unthinkable until recently. These confirmations were not just words. Vladimir Putin himself personally received some of the North Korean soldiers during the Great Victory Day parade in Moscow in May 2025. It was the first time the whole world had clear proofs that North Korea was already directly involved in the war. Sources of intelligence claim that about 11,000 North Korean soldiers have been in action in Ukraine, especially in violent battles that occurred in the Kursk region. According to Moscow, these soldiers played an essential role in expelling the Ukrainian forces from some strategic areas. But what is most amazed is not just what has already been done. According to the new intelligence information, Pyongyang does not intend to stop there. On the contrary, now, Kim Jong-un's regime prepares a colossal increase in this military support. North Korea would be ready to triple the number of soldiers sent to the war. That is, in addition to the 11,000 fighters who have already played on the front, an additional contingent of up to 30,000 soldiers will be able to board the battlefield, raising the total of North Korean troops involved in the conflict to over 36,000. Yes, you understand well. More than 36,000 North Korean soldiers fighting in Europe in the middle of 2025. This movement is not just symbolic. It carries a deep strategic meaning. Of course, sending soldiers to a conflict of this magnitude is not simple. The first experience of North Koreans on the battlefield was actually a disaster. With no appropriate training for modern war conditions and no preparation for high-intensity clashes, many North Korean soldiers suffered heavy loss in the first fighting. According to reports, the losses were so severe that the Russians had to remove these fighters from the front line, forcing an emergency retreat. But the story is not over there. These soldiers went through a new phase of intensive tactical training, away from the enemy lines. And what was seen in the following weeks surprised even the most experienced military analysts. After returning to the front, the North Koreans had a much higher than the initial combat capacity. They abandoned rudimentary tactics and began working in smaller, more agile and well-coordinated tactical groups. Their actions are no longer simple front attacks, involving ambushes, infiltration, and efficient use of the terrain. This performance leap confirmed that training was really effective and that the Russians were investing heavily to turn North Korean troops into high-level combatants. But there is still much more in this story. The logistics operation behind all this military movement is gigantic, and the details of this war engineering will surprise you. Treat tens of thousands of soldiers to a war that happens thousands of kilometers away is no simple task. The logistics involved in this troop sending is one of the most complex ever seen in recent decades. According to intelligence information, Russia began adapting airplanes and military transport to be able to move large contingents of soldiers by the vast extent of Siberia, a region that borders North Korea. It is a true military corridor between Pyongyang and Moscow. Satellite images revealed constant movements at two strategic points: Sana Airport in North Korea and Dunai Port in Russia. These records confirmed that shipping is not limited to soldiers. North Korea is also sending huge amounts of ammunition, as well as heavy weapons such as obuses. The scene is impressive. Whole trains of trucks, ships and trains loaded with North Korean war equipment crossing the borders. increasing Russia's combat force on the Ukrainian front. And don't stop there. In addition to the transportation of equipment and troops, there are also records of joint military training between Russian and North Korean soldiers. In April 2025, a video released by the Russian state press showed troops from both countries performing side-by-side training. The images exhibited urban combat simulations, one of the most dangerous and complex struggle modalities of modern war. There were also training for defense against drones, which became one of the biggest threats faced by land forces in Ukraine. These joint exercises are not mere symbolic events. They reflect a real and growing integration between the two armed forces, with the North Koreans being increasingly integrated into Russian operations. The linguistic, cultural, and military doctrine barriers, which initially seemed insurmountable, are being slowly overcome. North Korean soldiers are already side by side with the Russians, in a degree of cooperation that was not seen even during the Cold War times. For international analysts, this alliance has implications that go far beyond the battlefield. Kim Jong-un's decision to broaden his nation's participation in war is not just an act of ideological solidarity. This is a carefully calculated strategy. By sending tens of thousands of soldiers to the conflict, North Korea is building a dependency relationship with Russia. In other words, Pyongyang puts Moscow in a debt position, a debt that should inevitably be paid in the future. And what does North Korea expect in return? Analysts point to two main goals. First, economic gains. Faced with severe international sanctions, Pyongyang sees in Russia a source of fuel, food, and other essential resources for the survival of its regime. Second, and perhaps more important, access to advanced military technologies. In exchange for sending soldiers, North Korea would be receiving modern weapons, missile systems, drones, and possibly even Russian nuclear technologies. This blood agreement can raise the North Korean military capacity to a new level, making Kim Jong-un regime even more dangerous in Asia. And at the same time, he assures Russia an almost unlimited flow of soldiers to feed his war effort in Ukraine. But cooperation is not limited to the battlefront only. Kremlin recently confirmed that, in addition to soldiers, North Korea will also send 1,000 engineers and 5,000 specialized civil workers in military construction to the Kursk region. They will be responsible for tasks such as demining, reconstruction of destroyed bridges, and construction of bunkers and trenches. That is, the North Korean presence spreads over all fronts: combat, logistics, reconstruction, and engineering. This increase in participation marks a profound change in the strategic dynamics of the conflict. The alliance between Russia and North Korea not only reinforces Russian troops on the front line, but also solidifies the partnership between Moscow and Pyongyang, openly challenging the Western powers. For Kim Jong-un, this war represents a unique opportunity. Its soldiers are gaining an invaluable combat experience, facing a high intensity and state of the art war, something North Korea had never faced before. In addition, access to weapons and technologies offered by Russia is dramatically raising the military power of the North Korean regime. Meanwhile, the world watches with growing concern to this new chapter in the Ukraine war, a war that increasingly ceases to be just a dispute between Russia and Ukraine and becomes a stage for dark alliances, where authoritarian regimes come together, exchanging gun and technology soldiers, a spiral of violence that seems to end. The direct involvement of North Korea in the Ukrainian conflict represents a point of inflection not only for the East European equilibrium. Behind this intense movement, there is a long-term geopolitical game being meticulously executed by Kim Jong-un. By sending troops, weapons, and civil workers to Russia, the North Korean leader not only reinforces Moscow's military effort, but also expands his influence, positioning North Korea as an indispensable actor on the international scene. The alliance between Russia and North Korea, which once seemed unlikely to reach such a level, is now seen as a high-level strategic cooperation. This partnership has already been formalized through a comprehensive military and strategic cooperation agreement, which provides for mutual assistance in various sectors. For Kim Jong-un, this agreement represents a kind of external threat insurance, a guarantee that, if its regime is militarily challenged, it can rely on Russian support, including in the technological and intelligence field. However, this mutual dependence creates a dangerous cycle. The more North Korean soldiers participate in the war, the more dependent Russia becomes this flow of military labor. And the more Russia depends on North Korea, the more influence Kim Jong-un wins, thus managing to bargain valuable concessions such as fuel, wheat, military technology, and, according to some sources, even nuclear weaponry. In practice, this means that North Korea is conquering, in the battlefield of Ukraine, what it would never achieve through diplomatic negotiations. With each new train of troops or ammunition sent, Kim Jong-un reinforces his internal power, showing his people that he is able to challenge the West and keep his regime strengthened, even in the face of decades of economic sanctions. It transforms soldiers into a currency of exchange, while Russia transforms dependence into acceptance. Experts claim that the psychological impact of this alliance cannot be underestimated either. The presence of North Korean troops on the front sends a clear message to the world. Authoritarian regimes are willing to join militarily to challenge the Western order. This is a new paradigm, where dictatorship cooperation is no longer limited to diplomatic support or gun supply, but it includes direct shipping from soldiers to die in wars that do not even concern their territory. The symbolism of this movement is powerful. North Korean soldiers, marching side by side with Russian troops, represent the union of two authoritarian regimes willing to sacrifice lives on behalf of a strategic alliance. And more than that, it demonstrates that Russia, though still powerful, can no longer support the war effort in Ukraine, needing to resort to isolated countries to continue fighting. While the West observes with concern this scenario, Moscow and Pyongyang are still deepening their cooperation. Within Russia, state propaganda makes the most of the image of the North Korean soldiers, extolling their heroism and courage on the front. The Russian government presents these combatants as examples of loyalty and bravery, praising the alliance as proof that Russia is not isolated, but surrounded by allies willing to fight beside it. This rhetoric, however, does not hide the reality of the battlefield. Even with the increase in the number of soldiers, the war in Ukraine remains extremely difficult for Russian forces and their allies. Ukrainian resistance is still fierce, using modern tactics and Western weapons to inflict heavy blows to the invaders. Submission of North Korean troops may have temporarily reinforced some fronts, but it is far from a definitive solution to the problems faced by Moscow in the military field. For the North Korean soldiers, the war also imposes a very high price. Many of them, without any prior experience in combat of this level, are sent directly to the front lines, where they face a brutal war marked by incessant bombings, armed drones, and high-precision artillery systems. Survival rates between these combatants remain extremely low, and reports indicate that thousands of North Koreans have lost their lives since they were sent to the conflict. Even in the face of these massive losses, Kim Jong-un's regime remains relentless. North Korean state propaganda completely ignores the casualties and displays only images of triumphant marching soldiers, as if the war were a patriotic parade. Within North Korea, the sending of troops to Russia is presented as a sacred duty, a historical mission that places the country at the center of the fight against Western imperialism. However, behind this propaganda curtain, the reality is much more raw. Sources of intelligence state that many North Korean soldiers have been forcibly recruited, without refusal, and that whole families are threatened if their relatives refuse to fight. In addition, the conditions of transport and food of these soldiers are precarious, with entire trains' records facing the lack of supplies in the journey by Siberia. Even so, the flow of troops gives no signs of decrease. On the contrary, it seems that North Korea will continue to send soldiers and civil workers to Russia in the coming months, further consolidating this dark alliance and deeply remodeling military balance in Europe and Asia.